You probably thought the picture you clicked on was bait, but it's not, so I got some explaining to do. Let's cover not only the top mounted position for a red dot, but also the side canted position. I have a few optic types, some alignments with the bore, and some optic heights to consider. I'm going to include some other optics in these configurations later and some zeroing considerations based on these positions, so stick around. Let me first tell you how I got into this mess, because the difference between the two positions is night and day. Literally. It's no surprise a fixed power optic isn't as fast up close as a red dot type, so I first bought the top mounted position, which came with my ECOS. I spent plenty of time with this setup training out the head position required for this higher height over bore. Once you run it a lot, it becomes manageable, almost to the point that you forget where the usual position of a dot is. But I never really felt good about this position. This high height over bore can be dangerous when peaking above cover. Not only because you now have to pop up higher, risking exposure, but you can also strike the cover itself in a hurry when not paying attention, like a barricade slot or a car hood. Yes, you can cant the whole rifle, but that causes its own problems in the trajectory, like you saw in my shooting off angle video. I got the idea, just like everyone else, to try the canted position, starting with the T-Rex arms mount. Why? Well, it's pretty cheap, and it's one piece besides the clamp plate, which means less parts to rattle loose. Problem here is this sucker sits really low to the bore. I've shot Absolute a good chunk of my life, and this thing just feels super low in use with the RMR, which has a pretty low profile. So the T-Rex height is lower than the Arasaka, so I'm having a hard time smashing my face down. When I draw up, the dot is pretty much resting in the top of the RMR. So I come up, I have to smash my face down more to take my shot because the T-Rex is too low. I did also buy the T-Rex offset spacer to bring the RMR up a bit, but it was still lower than the Arasaka mount, so I still had to smash my cheek into the stock a bit. The main thing I didn't like about the mount is that it's not perpendicular to the center of the bore. You can see here if we draw a line from the center of the bore to the center of the optic plate, it's not only off-center, but it's slightly canted. Most people won't care about this, but I do. Let me actually show you what an off-axis mount does to the trajectory. We'll take both an inline optic and an offset optic. When a round is loaded into the chamber, it obviously follows the bore or barrel path as it travels upward to the optic where you zeroed it, at a distance of your choice. The centered optic on the left and the canted optic on the right are both straight in line with the sight as the projectile travels upward vertically toward the optic height above bore, sometimes above this sight line, and then descends back down, re-intersecting the sight axis, all in line from beginning to end. This yellow line is our sight axis above the bore axis, using the canted RMR in line when we tilt the rifle. If we move the RMR and our sight axis to the right, like this T-Rex mount, and fired around, we would have a parallel trajectory to the side all the way down this exact same path. Elevation didn't change, but our impacts would always be left of our point of aim, just like zeroing a laser using a parallel method. Now, if we don't like this parallel zero, we can make sure our impacts intersect not only center in elevation, but also in windage by re-zeroing. When we do this, our sight axis not only converges in elevation, but also horizontally since the mount is not in line. You won't notice any changes again in your holds elevation-wise, but after we fire around, and it passes our first zero distance intersection here, it will start to deviate horizontally out to further distances, possibly resulting in a miss further out. You can rectify this by truing in the dot centered horizontally out at your second intersection point. You'll still have a crossover after that point, but the minute of angle isn't nearly as severe when using an off-axis mount like this. I still zero my backup dots to be used out to 300 just like a normal dot, which causes problems if not properly in line with the bore, so I gifted this to a friend that might enjoy it. I then got the Arasaka offset, which as far as I can tell, is concentric to the bore and a bit higher up, even with the T-Rex arms spacer. Using this height is much better with low-profile dots like the RMR or the Holosun. This has to do with the smaller window of the RMR, which has a greater margin of error to find the dot as you get your sight picture under pressure. Something the size of an EOTech is kind of hard to miss during presentation, but the RMR has a small window of opportunity to catch your sight alignment under pressure. This is also why the lower T-Rex mount was a pain using the RMR. This Arasaka mount can be rotated inward or outward if you like your backup dot to be tight or away from the main optic housing. With it outward, it helps a bit with the bumping on your night vision, although now you have to cant the rifle a bit more. Tucked in is pretty sweet because it's more intuitive to a centerline presentation of the weapon, which is more natural. And another cool thing is being able to use my Knight's offset irons if I use the Arasaka turned inward to the optic, because outward they get blocked by the mount. Arasaka did a good job with the angle cut when rotating the mount to maintain centerline over the bore, avoiding an off-axis trajectory. You can also use open emitter dots or enclosed dots if you buy the numerous footprint plates they sell to fit your desired optic. The main thing I hate about this setup is the snag factor. Not just gear, but out in the wild, this thing is a liability to get caught on crap, and the most important thing of all, bumping on hard surfaces, risking your Zero's integrity. It must also be mounted to the upper receiver, either forward in front of the ACOG, or behind, especially when running an SPR mount with an LPVO. I highly suggest you do not attach these to the handguard, since you run the risk of rotating your handguard loose from hard impacts on the offset mount, or just a loose design that could lose your Zero like the 4-bolt Daniel Defense handguards. Not the Riz, you're still okay. You could remove the rear iron sights and run this mount behind the ACOG to keep everything compact. Since I've been liking this rear position and keeping my irons, I decided to get the Unity mount, which has a one-stop shop to get the offset dot, whether a micro or RMR, and keep it compact and close to the ACOG. Problem here is they've been out of stock for months. I filmed this before I released the Unity COG mount video, so I decided to make my own COG mount. They did, however, have the RMR and micro plate in stock, as well as the offset mount, and I had an extra TA51 Colt mount that I didn't use to sacrifice. I went to visit my good friend at Imperial Machine Co. to make my own offset ACOG mount. I could mount it to the non-clamp side, but everyone knows you run your knobs away from the body to avoid snag factor, and to rip the charging handle back, so we decided to mount it in between the knobs on the clamp plate side. Well, the Unity offset mount is too wide to fit in between the knobs since it has a 4-bolt lockup, so we threw it on the mill and removed some material. We did lose 2 mounting bolt locations with this chop and the proper strength, but relax, this was just for testing. The new mount fits like a glove, and now we just have to drill and tap the ACOG mount between the thumb screws. Once this was done, we have our mount ready to test this placement using our not-so-Unity COG mount. This does sit at the same height as the Unity offset, but the ACOG is obviously lower. This is fine for day use, but any kind of night vision use passively is crap. To improve this, I switched the RMR plate out for the micro plate, which raises the dot a bit further to aim passively, but didn't have much luck. Still a bit too low. I even tried this micro setup in the top position to aim passively, but I don't own the TA02 ACOG with the forward mount, so I did some testing with gaffer's tape. An enclosed red dot like this Holosun will protect your LED powered dot from the elements such as rain. I won't get into this too much, but rain and debris can cause some issues. This wasn't too bad passively, but I couldn't get the angle exactly right without the proper mount, and after running this for a while, I checked back on the Unity site and voila, in stock. I wanted to use this offset passively, but it's still too low. On top of that, the ACOG sitting higher bumps the dual nods here. The lower ACOG actually bumps less using the dual tube with the offset, but you can get the mono tube to work decently well. We know that a rear RMR bumps the nod since it has a higher mass of material here, especially with the rear microdot size optic. Don't do this, by the way. But when removed, the nod does not hit since the RMR body is gone and the ACOG is low enough to clear. I then picked up an SRO to test under night vision because this larger sight window is not only much better passively, but also faster to pick up and maintain under night vision when moving. Problem here is that it still bumps the nod just like the RMR did in this rear position. Well, this is where the TA02 comes in. T-Rex Arms and Arasaka coming in strong with the new micro mounts for the TA02 and TA110 ACOG, and I already have the regular RMR plate to try as well. The forward mount for the RMR is a pretty good idea for passive shooting, but problem is I don't own this TA02 model, so I guess I'll make my own. I got my plates in the mail 2 days after the mount released from the super fast shipping at T-Rex Arms, and I have 2 TA01 NSN models to sacrifice for you, the viewers. Checking both mounts, the TA02 version sits higher in the forging, so the TA110 mount won't work. The TA02 mount is the only one compatible with this TA01 NSN body. This model has a slightly lower mount on the forging, and the longer stretched out body is deceptive for clearance, so I can only use the TA02 micro mount version. I guess one TA01 NSN gets to live a little bit longer, and I bought this mount for nothing. First, we got to grind down the sides to TIG weld our design. The ACOG coating is similar to the factory AR coating, so it's got to go. Next, we got to take some bar stock and cut 2 mounting feet on a chop saw for the plate to actually mount on. After this, he drilled them on the mill, followed by a tapping process to match the Trijicon/Arasaka screw threads. To get this right, we simply screwed our new feet onto the mount to hold them in place and planned the position out both forward and level using the flat top on the ACOG. Once we got that, a little super glue to hold it in place for the welding step that's up next. Now that it's dry, he fired up the TIG welder and ran a few test welds on the aluminum since it's much softer than steel is. Neither of us know how thick the ACOG is, so it's best to stay on the safe side so we don't ruin this $1,000 optic. First a tack weld on each side because the super glue is weak, and then a few extra welds for strength around the new brackets.
Good thing they're waterproof.
Now that we got it all welded on, it's time to spray paint the mount black, finishing up my TAO 1.02 ACOG. How did it work? Well, we'll get to that. Alright, time to get to the point. First, let's talk about versatility and unorthodox positions. If we pretend this lowercase y represents the position of a canted dot, reversed of course for a right-handed setup, and this lowercase I is the top position. Now let's add the ACOG position here, the RMR positions, and of course the barrel bore location below here on each one, and now you can visualize what I'm saying a bit better. If we are shooting from behind vertical cover, I'll let you know right now that the top position is better. If we peek to the right on both setups, the top mount basically feels like a normal dot in line how we're used to shooting. You may have to be careful that the barrel has cleared the cover to avoid a strike with this higher height over bore optic. With the canted position, you have to lean your head instead of the rifle if you want to stay slim behind cover. This would send your trajectory up and to the right, or you could cant the rifle a bit, putting your offset dot in the vertical position above the bore how you zeroed it for a vertical trajectory. This does, however, put more of your weapon and arm out in the open. Even if you tuck it, your wrist is now kinked, which is unnatural under pressure. To the left side of the cover, you'd want to switch shoulders to avoid overexposure, but this side cant makes you tuck the mag inward toward the body to get that left eye behind the optic. This lean basically keeps your optic and bore vertical, but this movement isn't symmetrical like the top mount version was. Switching shoulders is basically a bilateral clone using the top mounted position that is more intuitive naturally, where the canted position, not so much. Jumping to a barricade, these issues get even worse. Don't put too much emphasis on the barricade itself. These are just to simulate awkward positions you could potentially encounter, whether it be through brush where branches could knock your trajectory off course from a ricochet. The horizontal slot could simulate shooting under your vehicle. The angle slot could simulate shooting from a vehicle's seat while stopped. And the squares could simulate small windows defending a building like your home. Things like that. The top mounted version may be a bit high, to the point where you either can't see what you're aiming at, depending on the slot size. But at least it's consistently the same whether you're high or low in position, or switching shoulders. The canted position may be easier to see the target while keeping your barrel at a safe height, avoiding a barrier strike, but man does this thing suck in awkward positions. You can see how I have to be mindful of the under rotation to keep the offset dot in line with the bore. Switching shoulders, you're now over-rotating the rifle for that same optic bore alignment through the slot. Moving to the ground position is about as bad as it gets. Do you lay prone level and cant the rifle a bit, making inclined shots almost impossible? Or do you roll onto your side while also tilting your rifle in a whole new rotation that sometimes is impossible? The top mount allows these higher angles in the prone much better and is very intuitive shooting from your non-dominant shoulder. The canted position again is quite the pain. The same problems you saw earlier from non-dominant shouldering to rotations to complement your position and the eye you're using is a super pain. The only place this is good is in the standard prone position, since you don't have to lift your head up as high to get behind the dot. But hey, that's why you have the ACOG. Because this top position seems to be more versatile in position changes, I wanted it to be a better 1x at close ranges. The canted is much faster for up close action, so I ran both the SRO and the micro up top with a 193 red dot as a time control to see if it was clearly faster. That's not bad with the SRO. I do gotta get it zeroed a little bit, but I mean that is up there height wise. 154. This one's definitely not. It's not intuitive. It sits higher. The alignments with the dot and then the body's just so random every time being this high. Especially under pressure. But it's real top heavy too. It's like when you wave going panning across things like this. I like the SRO better. It sucks you need this for weather, for rain and everything.
Right.
SRO get. I mean, a little bit, you got caps, but I'd probably say that overall, I like the SRO better. I think the SRO is cooler than the micro dot up top. Just the weather, that's the only problem you run into. As far as speed transitioning between the ACOG and your dot position, they both pretty much suck. What I mean is jumping up to the dot doesn't line up as fast like you may think, which is the main thing you have to train out. The side position is super fast for 1x use, but the whole rotation to your ACOG isn't as good as you think. Depending on the dot height, when you rotate, it doesn't line up like you think, and you have to adjust to the different heights. Not so much with the Unity mount, but this stock height you're not always lined up unless you run the ACOG setup. You'll have to learn your head position changes depending on your choice. The top, ironically, is faster for passive, and the side is faster for the day. When reversed in their roles, they are actually both quite slow. I personally think that getting the top position to be used as a 1x is more doable through training than getting the side position to work passively. Just a few things for those who plan to use this for passive night vision. The canted T-Rex mount is too low even with the spacer. The ACOG mount is almost high enough, but not quite. The micro body is taller, bringing up your center dot a bit, but it's still not good passive. I did mount the ACOG on top of a Yankee Hill 1/2-inch riser, which surprisingly did work if you watched my passive night vision series. 1.3.
So it's weird. It's kind of like a sleeper setup. Like you wouldn't expect it to do well given that all the other offset 45s have done so poorly.
If you want to run the canted passively, you'll want to add some sort of spacer or riser to get it up pretty high. But by the time you do this, well, you're right back to the height of the top mounted dot, the better passive position. Just not to the rear of the ACOG. Because the top mount position is best for passive, let's go over some optic choices. First, don't use the fiber model RMR. In the sun during daylight, you can see it fine, but if shooting from a dark position into a light position, the fiber doesn't draw in enough light and you can't really pick up the dot. This basically has all of the same problems the fiber ACOG had in my ACOG reticle video. Not only does this model have a huge 7 MOA dot, but passively it's not lighting reliable. The push button RMR is awesome since you can adjust it for day or night, even though the window is still kind of small. The hollow sun dots seem to work pretty good passively, both the RMR version and the micro version. Although I've had some random reflections inside the housing that annoy me. You could put the AEMS up top if you have a pick rail mount. I'm just kidding, don't do this. SRO, by far my favorite to date. Weak housing? Maybe. Safe from the elements? Nope, it's an open emitter. Large window to pick up during the day or passively? You bet it does. You might be surprised to find out that the SRO actually has an objective window that's larger than a micro. Not only from the front, but if you look from the rear, you can see how large this sight picture actually is. If it weren't for bad weather conditions, this would probably be the ultimate optic for up top. Wow, is this thing awesome. The thin bezel practically disappears under passive aiming. It's super lightweight, it's slim, and with this new forward position, I can pick it up faster both during the day and night passively. I almost considered putting one of these on everything up top for passive aiming. It's almost exactly what I was looking for. You'll see how this stacks up later in my passive night vision part 5, but I want to recap the two positions before we talk about zeroing. Passively, the top position is awesome, if forward of course, and the canted is mostly bad. In random positions, the top is more intuitive, although high, risking bore strikes, and the canted is mostly bad. As a 1x day solution, the top is decent with some training, and the canted is very fast and natural. You could, however, run both RMR positions since the RMR in plate is only 2 ounces, with a hair more for the ACOG, but I'll pass. Too much crap going on for me. If I could only pick one, it'd be the... Because the top mounted position is a staggering 4.55 inches above the bore, we need to talk about zeroing. How did I get this height? Well, I measured it. From rail to height, the SRO sits at 3.341 and the slightly taller micro sits at 3.347. And don't forget to add this to the 1.21 from center of the bore to rail, giving us a 4.55 inch height over bore with these two optics. This is a good bit higher than the Unity micro setup at 3.47, which I went over in my 2-part red dot zero videos. To better understand this next part, I highly suggest watching these videos, especially if you choose the canted side option. Now let's take this micro dot height over bore out of a 14.5 inch barrel with a general velocity of 2920 using the M855 SS109 cartridge. I'm using this because it's also what this BDC in this particular ACOG is designed for. Let's pretend someone told us to zero this top dot at 25 yards for CQB, since it's good for short range passive shooting and a possible 1x option. With this trajectory angled upward much more using this higher height over bore, even more than the Unity fast height, you can see at 100 yards it will impact 11.6 inches high. Traveling out to 200 yards, it'll be a crazy 21 inches high, then reaching the max ordinate of 22.29 inches at 245 yards. Headed back down to 300 yards, it will impact 19.89 inches high, finally crossing under our line of sight at 401 yards, giving us a 25.4010. This is a terrible idea in my opinion, risking a high trajectory like this. If we go back to the beginning, let's use some other zero distances since we know this high height over bore changes our familiar zero properties like a 36-300 or maybe even a 50-200. Imagine someone who zeroes this top dot for 50 yards above an LPVO, for example, that is also zeroed at 50 yards because they think the zero behaves the same way. We'll also add a 75-yard zero and a 100-yard zero to see what happens. Out to 100, they're pretty much better than the 25-yard zero, and our 50-yard zero not only has a 5-inch max ordinate at 168 yards, but it doesn't cross back under our line of sight until 263 yards, giving us a 52.63. As we approach the 400-yard distance, we can take our impact points for each zero and package them up on an IPSC target to see our overall group sizes. It turns out that our 75-yard zero using this higher height over bore performs more like a 5200 using a lower 1/3 height optic like an EOTech EXPS3. Our 100-yard zero is a 100-150 with a 15-inch low impact at 300 yards. The point of this is to care about how you zero your optic heights, and when someone tells you their top-mounted dot is a 5200-yard zero, you know they're full of crapola. I'm going to shoot my top-mounted SRO out to 250 yards and try to guess what zero I'm using. Alright, ready?
Yep.
Stand by. Time.
1736.
That
You are so used to those ACOGs, it's not even funny.
That was all SRO.
Really?
Yeah. Aside from my crappy shots at 300 yards, it turns out this 4.55-inch height over bore on my 14.5 setup likes the 72-yard zero, which is basically the higher height clone zero of the 5200. This is a 72-200 zero. I can still use my dot just like a combat zero to point and shoot. I prefer something closer to a 36-300, but I wanted to show you how good a proper zero works with this top dot setup. This video took way too long to make, so I'm going to cut it here and go over top mounted zeros in another video so I can focus on that subject in particular. You'll see the SRO ACOG combo return in a few videos coming up, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. The enclosed micro dot up top is a good idea for adverse weather conditions. It's just a little too bulky for me, so I'll be running the SRO in this configuration for the time being. As far as choosing top or side, you're going to have to decide that yourself. I can only tell you my thoughts so far. As always, thanks for watching, and thanks to those who bought a copy of my low ammo range handbook listed in the description. I'll see you all on the next video drop.